Give me the fat one. The shout split the square, raw and merciless, and Eleanor Callahan felt the sound land on her body before it reached her ears. Laughter followed instantly, sharp and unrestrained, as if her flesh itself had invited it. She stood where she had been told to stand, broad shoulders tense beneath a plain dress pulled too tight at the seams, her weight pressing into the packed dirt of Boonesborough like an accusation she could never lift. Men looked her over openly at her hips, her belly, the slow rise and fall of her breath, judging not her face, not her eyes, but how much space she took up in the world. Eleanor lowered her gaze, cheeks burning, hands clenched at her sides. She had learned that shrinking was safer than resisting. Then the noise began to thin. Boots stepped forward. Heavy ones. The crowd quieted, not out of kindness, but caution. When the voice spoke again, deep, steady, unashamed, it did not laugh. I said, I'll take her. Eleanor looked up, fear tightening her chest, because no one ever chose her without meaning to break her, Boonesborough. Kentucky lay where civilization thinned and manners wore out fast. The square was nothing more than packed dirt, bordered by wagons and rough timber buildings. The air heavy with the sour bite of whiskey, horse sweat, and unwashed men. Voices carried easily, here judgment always louder than mercy. In a town like this, people learned early what they were allowed to be and what they would never become. Eleanor Callahan had learned that lesson too well. She stood near the center of the square, her body impossible to overlook. She was heavy thick through the hips and belly, broad in the shoulders, her weight pulling her posture downward no matter how hard she tried to stand straight. Her dress, plain and dark, had been chosen to hide her shape, yet it only emphasized it, stretched tight where fabric was never meant to stretch. She felt her body constantly, the way one feels a bruise when pressed, aware of every fold, every place where eyes lingered too long. But Eleanor was not careless, nor dull, nor weak-minded as the men assumed. Her movements were measured, controlled, shaped by years of learning how not to draw attention. She spoke softly when she spoke at all. She listened more than she talked. She noticed everything. Caution had become her second nature, not because she lacked spirit, but because spirit had never been safe to show. Her face, round and soft, still carried traces of a gentler past, pale skin, freckles faint across her cheeks, eyes the color of rain-soaked stone eyes that had once looked forward instead of down. When she was younger, before grief hollowed her home, Eleanor had been a diligent, thoughtful girl. Her father, Patrick Callahan, had taught her numbers and letters at the kitchen table, trusting her with ledgers and accounts, while other girls learned little beyond sewing and silence. Under his care, she had felt useful, respected, seen. That ended when he died. After Patrick's death, the house grew smaller, money vanished, certainty vanished faster. Eleanor's body, already larger than most, became another unspoken problem, another thing her mother did not know how to protect. Anne Rowan remarried quickly, choosing survival over confrontation, safety over truth. Lester Rowan brought whiskey into the house, and with it, a kind of attention Eleanor learned to fear. His words were cruel, his hands worse. He called her ugly, he called her too big, and yet his eyes followed her with a hunger that made her skin crawl. Eleanor learned then that her body was both despised and desired, and that either way, it did not belong to her. She endured. That was her defining trait. She endured insults without answer. She endured hunger without complaint. She endured shame by making herself smaller in spirit, if not in flesh. She learned not to ask for help because help came with conditions, not to fight back because fighting back only made things worse. Endurance became her armor, though it was a heavy one, so when she was taken, traded in a drunken gamble, and delivered west like cargo, Eleanor did not scream. She did not beg. She went quiet, retreating inward the way she always had. By the time she reached Boonesborough, she no longer expected fairness, only survival. Now she stood in the square, surrounded by men who saw her as excess. Too much weight, too much woman, too much inconvenience. Eleanor kept her eyes lowered, hands folded in front of her belly, as if apologizing for it. She waited to be ignored, or mocked, or discarded. She did not expect to be chosen. The man who stepped forward did not fit into the noise of the square. Samuel Bearcliff moved with the economy of someone used to thin air and long winters. He was massive, but controlled every motion deliberate, grounded. His coat bore the marks of real weather, not town dust. A rifle rested easily at his side, not as threat, but as habit. Samuel's face was carved by loss, as much as by wind. He had buried a wife, a child. Those facts lived in the way he carried himself alone, even in a crowd. Distant, even when close. He did not speak often, and when he did, it was without performance. When his eyes settled on Eleanor, they did not skim or linger. They held, not on her sea, but on her stillness, on the way she stood, as if braced for impact, on the endurance written into her posture. Between them, something quiet but undeniable took shape. Eleanor felt it, to an unfamiliar tension that was not disgust, not fear, but something harder to name. And for the first time in years, she wondered not if she would survive, but what survival might finally cost her. They left the square without ceremony. No cheers followed them, no farewells. Only a low ripple of muttering, the sound of men disappointed that the spectacle had ended too soon. Eleanor walked beside Samuel Bearcliff, with her head lowered, every step heavy, her body moving on instinct rather than will. She had learned not to look back. Looking back invited comments, hands, laughter. Samuel did not touch her. That alone unsettled her more than any shove would have. Most men guided women the way they guided livestock, with a grip, a push, a claim made physical. Samuel simply walked, long strides measured to hers without comment. When she lagged, he slowed. When she stumbled over a rut in the dirt, he paused, steady as a post, until she found her balance again. They reached his wagon at the edge of town. It was plain and sturdy, scarred by travel. The boards rubbed smooth by years of use. A pair of draft horses waited patiently, steam lifting from their nostrils in the cool air. Samuel climbed up first, then turned and looked down at Eleanor. For a moment, neither spoke. Eleanor felt the familiar heat rise in her face. This was usually the point where a man assessed her weight out loud, deciding whether she was worth the effort. She braced herself, fingers digging into her palms. "You can sit," Samuel said at last, nodding toward the bench. "Not there, not careful. Just you can sit." She obeyed, awkwardly gathering her skirts, painfully aware of how the bench creaked under her. She waited for the sigh, the comment, the irritation. It never came. Samuel took the reins, settled beside her with space between them, and clicked his tongue softly. The wagon lurched forward, rolling away from Boonesborough and its watching eyes. Silence stretched. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. She had questions too many, but experience warned her to ask none of them. Questions led to answers she didn't want, demands she couldn't refuse, so she stared at her hands instead. Thick fingers twisted together, knuckles pale. "You don't have to talk," Samuel said without looking at her. The words startled her enough that she glanced up. His eyes were on the road ahead, expression unreadable. "I won't make you," he added. "Not today, not today." The phrase lodged somewhere deep inside her. It suggested a choice she wasn't sure she possessed. They traveled for hours, the town fading into scrub and open land. Wind moved through the grass in low waves. Eleanor's body ached with the constant sway of the wagon. Her hips stiff, her back sore. She adjusted her position carefully, ashamed of every creak of wood beneath her weight. Samuel noticed. He reached behind the bench, pulled out a folded blanket, and set it between them. "Sit on that," he said simply. "It'll help. No judgment, No pity, just practicality. Eleanor hesitated, then did as told. The blanket dulled the ache immediately. Her throat tightened, and she looked away quickly, unwilling to let him see the sudden moisture in her eyes. Kindness, when unexpected, could hurt worse than cruelty. After a long while, she spoke, her voice low and careful. "Why me?" Samuel's hands tightened briefly on the reins. The horses snorted, hooves crunching against gravel. "I saw how you stood," he said. She frowned. "Stood like you'd been hit before," he replied. "And were still upright." Eleanor swallowed. No one had ever described her that way. They called her large, clumsy, slow, never upright. He glanced at her then. Just once, not at her body, at her face. "Mountain winters don't care how pretty you are," Samuel said. "They care how long you last." The words settled between them, heavy and strange. Eleanor looked back down at her hands, but something inside her had shifted just slightly, a crack in the armor of endurance she had worn for so long. She did not trust him, not yet. But for the first time since her body had become a liability in other people's eyes, she felt that it might also be proof of something else, something unbroken. The land rose slowly as Boonesborough fell behind them, the road narrowing into a scar of dirt that climbed through scrub and stone. Pines thickened, their resin sharp in the cooling air, and patches of old snow clung stubbornly to the shaded hollows. Eleanor's body felt every mile. Her thighs burned from sitting so long, her back stiffened, breath coming heavier whenever the wagon lurched uphill. She hated that weakness, hated how loudly her body announced itself, even when she tried to be invisible. Samuel noticed without comment. He stopped when the horses needed water, not when she asked because she never did, but when he saw the strain in the way she shifted, the careful way she lowered herself from the bench, as if afraid of breaking something. He handed her a tin cup, filled it first, then turned away to tend the animals, giving her privacy to drink without feeling watched. At camp that first night, Eleanor waited for instructions. She always did. Her life had trained her to be useful only when told how. Samuel built the fire with practiced efficiency, stacking wood so the flames took quickly. He set a pot to warm and handed her a knife. "If you want to cut," he said. "If not, that's fine too. Choice again," offered casually, dangerous in its simplicity. She took the knife. Her hands knew work. They always had. She sliced onions thick and uneven, eyes stinging, grateful for the burn that let her look down without shame. Samuel moved around her without crowding, never brushing past, never claiming space with his size. When they ate, he did not watch her plate. He did not comment when she went back for more beans. He simply ate, slow and steady, as if hunger were not a moral failing. That night, when the cold pressed in and the fire sank low, Samuel rolled out bedding near the flames and nodded toward the warmer side. "You take that," he said. "I'll keep watch." Eleanor hesitated. "You'll freeze." "I won't," he replied. She lay down stiffly, wrapped in a heavy blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and pine. For a long time she stayed awake, listening to the forest breathe. Somewhere, an animal moved through brush. Samuel sat with his rifle across his knees, silhouette carved against firelight, unmoving. He looked less like a threat and more like a boundary, something solid between her and everything that had ever tried to take from her. Morning came pale and cold. Eleanor woke to the sound of water boiling and the smell of coffee. Samuel handed her a cup without ceremony. She took it with both hands, heat seeping into her palms, and for a moment she simply stood there, unsure what to do with a kindness that expected nothing back. The days settled into a rhythm as they climbed higher. The road became trail. Then, little more than a suggestion through trees and rock. Eleanor's body protested openly now. She sweated, gasped, leaned hard on the wagon rail when they stopped. Each time she waited for Samuel's patience to thin, it never did. When the grade grew too steep, He had her ride one of the horses while he walked, long strides eating the ground as if the mountain belonged to him. He adjusted the saddle carefully, testing the straps twice. Hands sure and respectful. She expected a joke, a sigh. Instead, he treated her weight as a fact of physics, no more shameful than snow or stone. "Tell me if it pinches," he said. Stepping back, no one had ever asked her that before. They spoke little. But not all silence is empty. Sometimes Eleanor caught Samuel listening when she hummed under her breath old Irish tunes her father had loved. Once, when her knee gave out on a loose stone and she swore softly. Samuel's mouth twitched, not mocking, not amused, just a fleeting sign of humanity. It startled her more than a laugh would have. By the fourth evening, they reached Bearcliff Ridge. The cabin stood solid against the slope, built of massive pine logs fitted tight. Roof pitched steep against heavy snow. Smoke lifted from the stone chimney in a steady plume. It was not a shack. It was a home forged by patience and stubborn survival. Eleanor stopped at the sight of it, chest tight with something dangerously close to wanting. Inside, warmth wrapped around her like a held breath finally released. The hearth glowed. Thick rugs softened the floor. Shelves lined the walls not with trophies, but books, worn and handled. A violin rested in its case near the table. The space was ordered, cared for, lived in. "You'll have the room upstairs," Samuel said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Upstairs. A room, hers. She climbed slowly, heart pounding harder than her body had on the trail. The bed was wide, the quilt clean and heavy. A basin of fresh water waited on the stand. Eleanor sat on the edge of the mattress, hands braced at her sides, afraid that if she lay down, it might all vanish. The days that followed were quiet. Purposeful, Eleanor cooked. She cleaned. She learned where things belonged and how Samuel moved through his space. He rose early, splitting wood with a strength that sent echoes through the trees. She woke to that sound, the steady rhythm grounding her. When snow fell, she swept the porch, breath fogging the air, body warming through work. Samuel never told her she was slow. He never told her she was in the way. Sometimes, in the hush of evening, memories surfaced unbidden. Her father's voice reading figures aloud, her mother's eyes sliding away. Lester's hands, the smell of whiskey. Eleanor did not speak of these things, not yet, but Samuel seemed to sense when the past pressed close. On those nights, he stayed nearer the fire, his presence quiet and constant, a wordless assurance that nothing would touch her here unless she allowed it. She began to eat without counting bites, to breathe without apology, to move through rooms without flinching. Her body was still heavy, still slow, still marked by years of shame, but it was also capable, strong enough to carry water, steady enough to hold a knife, real enough to matter. One evening, as she set bread on the table, Eleanor caught Samuel watching her, not her body, but her hands, the sure way she worked despite their thickness. "You've lived hard," he said, not accusing, observing. She met his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "So have you." Something settled between them then. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. Two people shaped by endurance, standing in a place that asked the same of them both. The knock came after dark. Not loud, not hurried. 3 measured strikes against the cabin door, slow, deliberate, confident. The kind of knock meant to announce ownership rather than request entry. Eleanor froze with a bowl in her hands. Stew sloshed against the rim, sending heat up her fingers, but she barely felt it. The sound traveled straight through her chest and lodged there, tight and breathless. She knew that knock. She had heard it before in different rooms, different towns, always followed by men who smiled, as if the world owed them something. Another knock, louder this time, Samuel rose from the bench without a word. He moved the way he always did when danger crept close, quiet, controlled, already prepared. He did not reach for Eleanor. He did not pull her behind him. He simply stepped between her and the door. His presence a wall of muscle and intent. Evening, Bearcliff. A voice called through the timber, smooth and oily. You going to invite a man in, or are we pretending we're civilized up here? Eleanor's stomach dropped. Randall Huxley's voice had a way of curling into a room before the rest of him arrived. It carried amusement and threat in equal measure. The sound of a man who had learned that cruelty worked best when delivered politely. She remembered it laughing across a gambling table. Remembered how it sounded when he realized he had won her. Samuel did not answer. Outside, boots shifted. Eleanor could picture him without seeing lean build. Clean coat despite the mud. A smile that never reached his eyes. Randall was not large, not imposing. He didn't need to be. He let other men do the lifting while he did the deciding. I've come to collect, Randall continued. Voice light. Would have come sooner, but mountains do have a way of slowing a man down. Worth the trouble, though. Eleanor set the bowl down carefully. Her hands were already shaking. The door rattled as Randall leaned his weight against it. Casual. Testing. You've got something that belongs to me, he said. Property tends to wander when it's allowed illusions. Property. The word scraped against Eleanor's spine. Her body reacted the way it always had, shoulders pulling inward. Breath shortening, the old instinct to disappear roaring back to life. She pressed her palms against the table, grounding herself in the solid wood. The warmth of the room, the knowledge that she was not alone. Samuel spoke at last. Leave. A pause. Then, a soft laugh. Ah, Randall said, that's not how this works. The door swung open before Samuel could stop it. Randall stepped inside without waiting for permission, torchlight flickering behind him where two men lingered in the trees. He took in the cabin with open interest, the hearth, the shelves, the upstairs stairs, like a man already deciding what he would take. Then his eyes landed on Eleanor. They slid over her slowly, not with hunger alone, but calculation. He smirked. Well, he said, you've been fed. The words hit harder than a slap. Eleanor felt her face burn, her body suddenly too present, too exposed. Randall's gaze dropped deliberately to her belly, her hips, the width of her stance. Didn't think you'd manage the climb, he went on. But I suppose when a man's got no standards. Samuel moved. He caught Randall by the collar and slammed him back against the wall, wood groaning under the impact. Randall's smile didn't vanish. It sharpened. Easy, he said, holding up one hand. I've got papers. He reached into his coat with exaggerated care, pulling free a folded bundle. He did not break eye contact with Eleanor as he held them out, as if the ink itself were a leash he still believed in. Legal, Randall said. Signed, witnessed. She was one fair and square. A debt paid in flesh. You know how these things go. Eleanor's ears rang. Images flashed, cards slapped down. Men cheering. Lester's breath hot with whiskey as he avoided her eyes. She felt the old, familiar weight press down on her chest. The certainty that no matter where she ran, someone would always arrive with proof that she did not belong to herself. Randall leaned closer, voice dropping. Come along, girl. I've been patient. I can be kind, too, if you don't make this difficult. Girl. Samuel's grip tightened. You're not touching her. Randall chuckled. You think this is about touching? This is business. She's an investment. Big one, too. His gaze flicked again to Eleanor's body. Men pay good money for what lasts. Something inside Eleanor snapped. Not fear, not shame, anger. It rose hot and fast, burning through years of swallowed words, through the lessons of silence her mother had taught her, through the nights she had lain awake believing her body was the reason bad things happened to her. She saw herself in the square at Boonesborough, men laughing at her sighs. She saw her mother's eyes sliding away, She saw Lester's hand pushing her forward. Enough. Her eyes went to the wall. The rifle hung there where it always had, dark wood, metal worn smooth. She had never touched it, had never believed she was allowed to. Now it called to her with a clarity that cut through the noise. Samuel felt her move and turned. Eleanor, she stepped past him. Her knees protested, her weight shifting hard into the floor. But she did not stop. She reached the wall and took the rifle down with both hands. It was heavy, solid, honest. Randall laughed. "You going to shoot me, fat girl?" The insult landed and slid off. Eleanor raised the rifle. The world narrowed to the steady rise and fall of her breath. She did not aim at his chest. She did not want his life. She wanted her own. The shot thundered through the cabin. Randall screamed as the bullet tore through his leg, dropping him to the floor in a tangle of curses and pain. He clutched at the wound, face draining of color, bravado spilling out of him like blood. "You," he gasped. "You stupid." Samuel was on him in an instant, hauling him upright by the throat. Randall's feet barely touched the floor as Samuel lifted him, eyes dark and merciless. "You will crawl out of here," Samuel said, voice low and absolute, "and you will never come back." Randall's gaze flicked to Eleanor. She stood there, rifle still in her hands, shoulders squared, body unhidden, no apology, no retreat. Understanding dawned in his eyes, ugly and sudden. This woman was no longer afraid. He broke then. Begging spilled out of him, promises tumbling over one another as Samuel released him. Randall hit the floor hard, dragging himself toward the door, leaving a dark smear behind him. He did not look back as he fled into the trees. His men scattering after him. Silence reclaimed the cabin. Eleanor's arms trembled now, the weight of what she had done settling in. She lowered the rifle slowly. Samuel turned to her not as a shield, not as a rescuer, but as a witness. "You chose," he said quietly. Eleanor met his gaze, breath shaking, spine straight. "So did he," she replied. "He chose wrong." Samuel nodded. And in that moment, he understood her not as someone to protect from the world, but as someone who could stand against it. The fire had burned low by the time Eleanor realized she was shaking. Not with fear. Fear had already burned itself out, but with the slow, delayed release of everything her body had been holding together. The cabin smelled of gunpowder and spilled stew, of pine smoke and cold air rushing in through the door Randall had fled through. Outside, the mountain had gone still again, as if it had watched, judged, and accepted the outcome. Samuel closed the door and slid the wooden bar back into place. The sound was solid, final. He turned, expecting to see Eleanor collapsed or weeping. She was still standing. The rifle hung heavy in her hands now, no longer fueled by fury, only reality. Her chest rose and fell unevenly. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. She looked like someone who had crossed a line and discovered she could not be pushed back across it. "You don't have to hold that anymore," Samuel said gently. Eleanor looked down at the rifle, then back at him. For a moment she hesitated, not because she feared him, but because laying the weapon aside felt like laying down a part of herself she had only just claimed. Finally, she leaned the rifle against the wall. Her knees buckled then, the strength draining out all at once. Samuel moved quickly, catching her before she fell, his hands firm at her arms, not lifting her like something fragile, but steadying her like an equal who had reached her limit. She did not pull away. They sat on the bench near the hearth, close enough to share warmth, but not so close it felt like possession. Eleanor pressed her palms to her thighs, grounding herself in the weight of her body, reminding herself she was real. "Still here, I thought," she said slowly, voice rough, "that when it happened, when he came back, I would freeze." Samuel waited. "I've spent my whole life freezing," she went on, "letting things happen because it was easier than fighting, because I was taught that fighting only makes things worse, especially for women like me." She swallowed. "Especially for women who look like me." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "When he called me property," Eleanor continued, Something broke. Or maybe something finally stopped breaking. She let out a shaky breath. I didn't shoot him because I wanted to hurt him. I shot him because I was done letting my body be the reason people thought they could own me. Samuel turned toward her fully then. I didn't choose you because I thought you were weak, he said quietly. But tonight, I realized I was still seeing you wrong. Eleanor's brow furrowed. Wrong, I thought my job was to keep you safe, he admitted. To stand in front of whatever came. That's what I know how to do. He paused. But you don't need a shield. You need room. The words landed softly, but they struck deep. She nodded once. I don't want to be hidden, she said. Not anymore, you won't be, Samuel replied. Not here. They sat in silence, then, not awkward, not heavy, the kind that allowed truth to settle into place. Outside, wind moved through the trees, carrying away the last echoes of Randall's voice. After a while, Eleanor spoke again. My mother taught me how to endure. She said she thought that was love. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt. Tonight, I learned something else. Samuel waited. That endurance isn't the same as living. He nodded, understanding written plainly across his face. When he finally reached for her hand, it was slow, deliberate, giving her time to pull away if she wished. She didn't. His fingers wrapped around hers, rough, warm, real. Not a promise, not a claim, an acknowledgement. Outside, the mountain held steady under the night sky. Inside the cabin, two people sat among the quiet ruins of a past that no longer had power over them, breathing, choosing, and, for the first time, meeting each other without fear. Spring reached Bearcliff Ridge slowly, as if testing whether it was truly welcome. Snow loosened its hold, retreating into shadowed ground beneath the pines, and thin streams of meltwater began to cut bright lines through the earth. Eleanor noticed the change in the land, the same way she noticed it in herself, not with celebration, but with cautious acceptance. The cabin still carried marks of the night Randall Huxley fled, a splintered frame, a dark stain on the floor. Neither Eleanor nor Samuel rushed to erase them. Those scars were reminders, not of danger, but of survival. Eleanor moved differently now. Her body was still heavy, still broad, still unmistakably her own, but she no longer tried to shrink inside it. She crossed the room without apology. She worked, rested, and stood beneath the open sky without folding herself inward. For the first time in her life, her body felt like a place she was allowed to inhabit. Samuel saw the change and understood it. He did not guard her more closely, nor praise her strength aloud. He gave her what she had never been given before: space, trust, and the quiet respect of a man who knew she could stand on her own. They worked side by side as the season turned. Bread rose on the table. Wood stacked high against the coming winter. Silence settled between them, no longer heavy, but shared. One evening, Eleanor stood at the ridge, looking out over the valley where snowmelt glinted in the fading light. Samuel joined her, his presence steady at her side. This place will be called something else someday, he said. Eleanor nodded. It already is. People would tell stories, as people always did, of a mountain where fear no longer ruled, of a woman who did not bow, of a home that could not be taken. They would give the ridge a new name, shaped by respect rather than dread. But names mattered less than truth. On Bearcliff Ridge, Eleanor Callahan lived unhidden, rooted in her body, her choices, and a life she had claimed for herself at last.